Horror Coast to Coast is a movie review podcast featuring strong language, horror film spoilers, and discussions of violence, gore, and disturbing subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Horror Coast to Coast.
Welcome to Horror Coast to Coast, where we discuss horror from opposite sides of the continental U.S. From the sanguine hollows of Massachusetts, I'm Brian.
And glittering under California's winter sun, I'm Michelle.
And this week we're opening up the Folklore Files, uncovering myths and legends that over centuries have evolved into the horrors that haunt our favorite movies and TV shows.
And we're starting with our favorite blood-sucking creatures of the night, vampires. Creatures born from our fear of each other and the cautionary tales meant to keep us indoors after dark. They seduce, they terrify, they kill, and they prey on our fear of what's hiding in the shadows.
The vampires we know originate in Eastern Europe, but did you know there's an equally as old kind of vampire from a totally different place thousands of miles away?
No.
Have you ever heard of the Jiangxi?
No.
China has their own vampires. They're called the Jiangxi,
Huh,
and
okay.
they're also known as Chinese hopping vampires.
Okay.
Now, this is a rabbit hole I fell down into about a decade ago, and I found it fascinating. So they evolved totally separately, but the word Jiangxi emerged around the same time as the word vampire. But the tropes had been building since around 200 BC in the Han Dynasty. So these vampires, they hop because of rigor mortis. They can't walk, they can't move their joints, so they hop. And instead of feeding on blood, they feed on ki, the life force. So they're still undead monsters that hunt people down and drain them of their life force.
Yeah.
But it's not blood. I always thought it was really interesting. And they have a very distinct appearance. They're in traditional Chinese robes, and they're often depicted with a paper talisman on their forehead where a monk has sealed them. So I thought maybe this was something you hadn't heard of, and
It is something.
yeah, it doesn't have much to do with the rest of what we're talking about, but thought maybe you'd find that interesting because I sure did.
No, that's super interesting. How do you kill them?
I didn't go that deep into it. Haven't seen anything about specific like ways to kill them, but I just find it really interesting that this kind of evolved separately, and all over Asia they're known as Chinese vampires. So they kind of emerged when we had our cultural exchanges. They kind of became cousins, if you will.
Huh. No, that's really interesting. And you're saying that it's not quite connected to what we're talking about. But it is in a way. And I was going to start by kind of pointing out that from my perspective and the direction I sort of took all this research in, it's kind of a misnomer that we're starting with vampires for the Folklore Files, because I think vampires are actually more primal than folklore, which I think is so interesting that you're talking about a creature that evolved from a culture on the opposite side of the world. I mean, the origin of it is way, way earlier, but, I guess coming into popular vernacular and coming into popular consciousness around the same time. That's very interesting. And I don't know, it ties in because, I was sort of looking at it as a human experience, a human fear.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think I started with cannibalism. And the reason I started with cannibalism, I mean, I guess it seems kind of obvious, but the thing is, it's taboo now, but it wasn't always taboo, right? And humans practice cannibalism for rituals and warfare and religious purposes and things like that. But it originally started out as something that was a part of like our cultural species experience, which is crazy to think about. But, once upon a time, it wasn't taboo. But then over time, I think, and I'm not an anthropologist in any way, but this is more just like how I envision this whole thing evolving is that as our interests become more in forming tight knit communities and structured societies, the act of consuming another person becomes like a social boundary because we're relying on structured communities to survive. And so it becomes essential that everybody internalize this idea. We don't eat people anymore, right? So you sort of start with, okay, we're doing this because this is, I don't know, I don't want to say in our nature, but it's kind of like where we started from a primitive standpoint. And then as we start to form communities, it then becomes a thing that we really can't be a part of because we need to rely on each other to survive.
Yeah. What I think is interesting is the other half of that is the undead portion, because I think our fear of corpses, like corpses instill fear in us. And that's also kind of like an evolutionary thing because we can't have corpses around giving us diseases. We had to come up with a way to take care of that. Both of the Zhangxi and the vampire, a lot of the origin comes from not following burial rituals. So it's kind
Yeah.
of like these things evolutionary probably kept us alive, our fear of vampires.
Oh, absolutely. And like you're pointing out that there's obviously other cultures that have their own versions. They probably have their own evolution for these ideas and these concepts. So me starting with cannibalism, that's not an absolute trajectory for um or kind of linking cannibalism to vampirism. It's not a trajectory for all cannibalistic cultures, but it feels kind of like an origin point for what we're talking about because I think that the idea of a vampire obviously comes up long before literature, long before movies and things like that. Um and I think the foundation of it is just
Yeah.
primal horror. And it also goes to what you're talking about, not just fear of death, but fear of the things that come with contacting corpses, you know what I mean? So, it's interesting, and, and vampires are not just cannibals, they're supernatural cannibals, right? Because they have strength and they have all these other qualities that
Yes. And that's also Zhangxi also have super strength, which I didn't mention. So
mm,
it's crazy how many parallels there were for two different kinds of vampires that emerged separately.
yeah. And then there's also the idea that I don't know what the Jiangshi look like, but I think there's an element of fear that's linked to the fact that vampires look
Yeah.
like us. So there's something that looks like us that preys on us, which again, I think taps into that primal fear of people needing to survive. And can we rely on each other or do we rely on ourselves? Because how dangerous is your neighbor, the people around you? Are they going to try to eat you?
Yeah.
As these, and instead of having that be the direct question, it turns into this idea of it's a creature doing it.
Yeah, and it's also like the uncanny valley, right? Because they look like us, but not
Yeah,
quite. So a lot of it comes from like when you see a corpse, it's like it looks like a person sleeping, but not quite, and that's what unsettles you.
yeah,
So, and
yeah,
yeah, the Zhangqi, they're corpses with rigor mortis, so they're gonna appear very similar to traditional vampires.
yeah. Um, and I think that when you start to talk about the development of structured societies, then you get to more concrete ideas of creatures that
Yeah.
prey on us. We have spirits and revenants and night demons and things like that, just blood drinking entities as a whole. Um, and that's in my mind a way to sort of explain sudden illnesses or wasting diseases, infant mortality, people vanishing, people being found dead for no reason before modern technology, modern medicine. You know, just random tragedies happened all over, and so vampires are kind of this or these these monsters are kind of this scapegoat to kind of explain these things away and maybe make us feel better, but also as a cautionary tale, right? Don't go out at night, don't wander alone, stick with the group. They're all kind of it's along the same vein, I think.
Yeah.
But, I did look into other cultures. I didn't go as far as China, um, but I think that as oral traditions start to turn into concrete myths, then you hear about vampires kind of being defined and having a little bit of consistent qualities. So in Romania, there's stories about the strigoi that rise from the grave to drink blood.
Yep.
And then in Greece, we have the lamia that preys on children and seduces men to feed on their blood. In India, we have the Vatala that inhabits corpses, draining the life and possessing the living. And then, of course, we have the Wendigo, which is cannibalistic and embodies the terror human predation. And then I threw in I don't know if it necessarily is included in this sphere, but I threw in chupacabra because it kind of feels like it
Well,
belongs there,
they
you
are
know?
bloodsuckers, so
They
I
are.
would say comes from kind of the same fear.
Yeah, they are, but they prey on our livestock, which I guess is our livelihood, so that kind of is where the link comes in. But there is a clear pattern between all of these cultures, right? The dead return, they violate bodies, they take life, they drink blood, um, and that, behind it all is something that either looks human or is similar to a human or is maybe something that used to be human. Um, and this is kind of where I was thinking the prototype for vampire kind of derives, right? And you were talking before about how, you had some thoughts about the vampire prototype. That's what kind of where I took it.
Yeah, so I was gonna mention that they kind of evolved out of revenants, and there's the etymology. It comes from Upior, which was like the 11th century, which slowly evolved into Umpire, and that came like vampire, and that became vampire. The revenant slowly evolved into the vampire, and also before the word vampire emerged, Leone Aletius was a Greek physician he's credited as being like the first person to like look into the vampire phenomenon. Basically, the first methodological study of vampires, which
Okay.
in Greece they called Vaikolakis. Vampire wouldn't, as a word, wouldn't actually emerge till about a century later. So the umpire had already existed and he had his own thing going. He was a Catholic.
Yeah.
That's a lot of the Catholic elements were from him and his studies, and they kind of merged into the
Yeah.
vampire.
And that's so interesting because that's exactly where I went with this. After, you know, you kind of get this nebulous creature that is responsible for tragedies and responsible for deaths and stuff. It becomes it takes a shape, it takes a form, and I sort of credited that to Judeo-Christianity coming in and adding elements because cannibalism is not just taboo, now it's sinful. Blood drinking isn't just scary, it's also evil, and
Yeah.
so that's when you first start to see vampires being associated with Satan and demons and hell and corruption of souls and stuff like that.
Yeah, because they had the concept of the demon already, so it was easy to apply all these nebulous fears from
Right,
all these cultures and be like, "Oh, yeah, that's a demon," and then that demon gets a name, and that name is the vampire.
right, and it's so interesting because it's kind of evolving alongside human culture evolving, right? Vampires are not just night predators anymore. Now they're spiritual threats. They're corruptors. Um, when they feed, it's not just for hunger. They're damning your soul. So it's just it's interesting to kind of see how it all evolves alongside each other. And maybe the idea is that the image of the vampire kind of evolves to encapsulate whatever fears we need to kind of drive the way our society behaves as a whole, you know?
Yeah.
Because the vampire then becomes this thing that has to be destroyed at all cost because the risk is losing your soul, right? Which wasn't a thing before. Before it was when it was more nebulous, it was stay away from it.
Mhm.
Don't let it in your house. Don't go near it. And then we start to get to this religious aspect, which is basically you have to destroy the evil.
Yeah. And I was interested in like all the classic vampire rules and when they came up, and I suspected a lot of them would be like from the era of gothic fiction. I was really surprised to find out how many of them predate the actual concept of vampires. Like a lot of it, the idea of garlic came from like medicinal uses and white magic long before the vampire. And the idea of silver was because it has natural like antibacterial properties and they didn't understand that. So they looked at it as a holy thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting that these tropes actually shaped the vampire rather than the vampire building its own rules over time. I didn't expect it to work like that. And some of the other things like sunlight burning them, do you know where that came from?
No.
Well, we witnessed the creation of sunlight killing vampires when we watched the original Nosferatu. That was the first instant of sunlight setting vampires on fire and killing them.
Oh, okay. So that particular thing is from, like, early 20th century. That's not something that's super dated. Okay.
Yeah. So I really thought things like mirrors and silver and garlic would have maybe been added later and that would have been earlier, but because you would think they're creatures of the night and that's part of the fear. So, like, I thought, that probably was an early defining feature, but no, that came way later and that surprised
Oh,
me. It surprised me that garlic predates the vampire and them bursting into flames came way, way later.
yeah. That is interesting. But then when you were saying that these rules start to take effect kind of in the Gothic Victorian era, I think that absolutely coincides with vampires finally becoming something that we recognize from a modern perspective, right? Because
Yeah.
at this point, you have people really start writing about these things. Like there's Carmilla, which I actually read in high school. Um, there's Dracula, but then there's also the Penny Dreadfuls. Do you know about that?
Only
Just like
vaguely. Yeah.
magazines that had like little horror stories in
Yeah.
them. So the Penny Dreadfuls were popular in this era, but it's interesting because this is a time when as a society, well, as a Western society, I should say, we're becoming fixated on science and reason, but also still kind of obsessed with purity and goodness. Um, so we're afraid of things like disease, we're afraid of foreigners, we're afraid of sexuality, we're afraid of degeneration. Um, but there's also a real class divide. And so in this context, vampires start well, from a literary perspective around this era, vampires also start to represent weakness of like weak constitution. Like if you were susceptible to a vampire, it said something about the moral fiber of your character,
Yeah.
right? Which is so interesting.
And that's kind of the origin of them needing to be invited in, which I also kind of thought would come later, but was actually pretty early on because the whole concept of demons is that you let them into your heart. So that became a literal, you let them into your home. They can't enter unless you want them to, or you let them, just like a demon might possess
Yeah,
you.
that's interesting because it kind of goes into this idea that if you not fraternize, but if you are somebody who would put yourself in the world of a vampire by inviting them in, then you embody this godlessness that they don't want to be associated with. That's kind of below where people should be in a civilized society. Um, and so essentially, they represent the unclean, which at this point is synonymous with poor and unworthy and all of those things. So it's interesting that there's like
Yeah.
socioeconomic um, implications in literature when you go over all the stuff from the Gothic era. I mean, it was honestly, it's a very fucked up time in our culture, but still has some of the most
Yeah.
interesting things to come out of it because it's almost we're kind of embracing a darkness, but still rejecting it on the surface. Very, I don't know, like denial is kind of a huge aspect of our consciousness at that point.
Yeah.
But then in this era, I mentioned Carmilla before. This is also where we have the introduction of the female vampire, which is interesting because, you know, I have a whole thing that I looked into when it comes to like gender politics and vampirism and things like that. But early on, I don't know if it's the first time because there could be some early writings that I wasn't aware of that had female vampires in it. But it's more frequent in this era where you see female vampires, um, which went against social norms because they're sexually assertive, they're predatory, but then they also blur the line between victim and aggressor because, as women being the perpetual victim, how can that be true when she's also one of these creatures that is stronger and is, more adept at killing and things like that. Um,
Now I'm wondering, did the sexual nature of vampires emerge with the Gothic literature era? Because before that, like in the 18th century, everyone believed vampires were literally real. And I don't think there was any sexualization about them. They were bloated, disgusting corpses, and people were just
yeah,
terrified of them.
I'm fairly certain, I didn't confirm it, that um, Le Fanu's book, Carmilla, is the first is the seminal material for vampires being eroticized. Like, I can look that up and
Mhm.
see, but I would say, yes, it's during this era, if not with that book specifically. I mean, there's probably a short story somewhere that came before it, and someone who's more learned about this topic will know exactly what it is, but
Imagine being the first person to get horny for vampires. That's wild.
that's insane. Kind of funny to think about. But yeah, so then you have this idea that vampires are not only monsters, but now they're sources of temptation, right? Because evil is tempting. And so that adds more of the intrigue to them, which I think is exactly why it took the trajectory it took towards the modern era. Like that
Yeah.
inserting those elements completely opened the door to creating the vampires we know today.
Yeah, because no one wants to be an 18th century vampire. That would suck. But like a modern vampire? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. No, definitely. But this is where I think when we emerge from that Gothic era and get to the modern era, this is where we get the concrete rules. This is where we start to get the climbing through the windows, needing an invitation, crucifixes, coffins, stakes, all of those things. That's where you start to see that in the literature. Um, so vampires are not ambiguous anymore. They're not just folklore. They are a recognizable monster with consistent rules. But they are also still something human shaped that survives by consuming humans. So they maintain the fear in all of these different forms of in all these different phases in their evolution, which is pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
and the rules, most of the rules, they kind of existed, but they weren't all agreed on and they weren't all from the same region. But at this point, they're like, it's a list of rules. Like you go down the list one, two, three, and that's like it's like all those scenes in movies where they explain the rules of vampires to the other survivors. It's like you got a list now.
Yeah.
And I think Dracula was really one of the big things that, like, it invented a bunch of new rules and also just really solidified all these vague legends that had existed for centuries.
Yeah. I think so too. I think that's where all of this stuff coalesces, right around the turn of the century. And all of the little snippets of things that were believed in by different sections of society, by different cultures, all come together. And that's where we get these rules. And it's interesting because I think that there is one aspect of it today where we all know the rules, but we also know that there are some times when a vampire story doesn't incorporate all of those rules, right? The obviously
Yeah.
obviously the best example is Twilight, where Edward Cullen doesn't burst into to ashes when he's in the sun. He sparkles.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, they aren't even vampires because they can go out into the sun just fine," but, like, as we've just discussed, that's a pretty new rule, like,
Yeah.
vampires existed way before that, so all these, like, bitter Twilight haters
Yeah.
who, like, get super hung up on that, if you're so gatekeepy about vampires, maybe you should read a little bit more about them.
Yeah. No, I mean, but I still think that even the way we look at it today, they all the rules don't apply, right? Because sometimes a stake doesn't kill them. Sometimes you have to cut off their head. Sometimes they sleep in a coffin. Sometimes they don't. So it's kind of we have the rules all ingrained within us at this point, but some stories can take the liberty of not enforcing all of them all the time.
Well,
Um,
that's how you keep the viewer on his toes.
yeah, what are the rules gonna be? Which ones are they gonna accept and which ones not?
I always love that moment when the thing doesn't work, when it's like, "Oh, they're vampires, so this is gonna work," and then they try it and they're like, "Fuck."
Yeah. I was gonna say, I have not seen anything that shows vampires having an issue with silver in a very long time.
Yeah, that's an underplayed one.
I feel like it's kind of fallen off the map a little bit.
I think werewolves stole the silver thing, I think.
Yeah, they really did. So then this is really where my interest in this picked up was this postmodern era, and a lot of it is in the 80s and 90s, which is so strange to me to think that a lot of these changes were so current. But in that time, we go from vampires being villains to being protagonists, to being anti-heroes, to being former humans with backstory and emotional complexity, and it completely changed the way you experience the vampire, because now there was this option where they could be a good vampire, right? And that was never a thing before.
So, I have a theory about exactly when this changed. So, we had Dracula, the book, and that defined so many things, and then we had Bela Lugosi's Dracula. So, Dracula in the book does not look like the Dracula we think of when someone says Dracula, because we think of Bela Lugosi or a cartoon of Bela Lugosi, like the Count from the Muppets or Count Chocula. Those are just parodies of Bela Lugosi.
Right.
In the book, he has long white hair and a thick white mustache. We never see that portrayal of Dracula anywhere.
Yeah.
And also, the Bela Lugosi version, curiously, didn't have fangs, and Christopher Lee, who did a derivative version of him years later, he criticized Bela Lugosi's portrayal because it's like, he wasn't mean enough. His smile wasn't sinister enough. His hands were too stiff and he wasn't intimidating enough. And I think that lent itself to the cartoonification of vampires, which, like, you know, I had so many toys like Pez dispensers, which I now realize were portrayals of Bela Lugosi long before I knew who he was. I didn't know that name until I heard the song Bela Lugosi is Dead by Bauhaus.
Yeah.
So, like, he became this icon, and it became like he became toys and he became comic books and all these things. So at that point, it wasn't pure fear. You could do whatever you wanted with a vampire, and that lent itself to good vampires, I think.
Okay.
Which, so I think that's kind of a direct parallel because the original one, he's basically Vlad the Impaler, right? But dead and with white hair, and
Yeah.
he's supposed to be really scary. And then the hairstyle we now associate with Dracula is like a slick backed black hair with a widow's peak from Bela Lugosi, which I think is so interesting how he just usurped the portrayal. He stole the portrayal of Dracula away from Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And now that, I think about it, and yes, I definitely was inundated with the Bela Lugosi version of vampires. And for a long time, Dracula was all vampires, right? There wasn't a variety. There
Yeah.
weren't other vampires. It was just Dracula. Um,
Mhm.
which is actually very interesting because I do think that that sort of gave license to people to start developing backstories and things like that. See, I was thinking the first, at least the first that I could find, where we start to explore vampires as these complex human entities, is Interview with a Vampire.
Mhm.
And that's interesting because if you think about like, honestly, it's not my favorite, but I do think the movie's interesting for a couple of reasons. Because first, it explores the idea of not just immortality, but experiencing different phases in human history. And not just human history that's in our memory, right? Things that we know about but didn't live through. He
Yeah.
he talks about it from a first person perspective, all the way up to, like, I think it's the 90s when he's being interviewed by Christian Slater. Um,
Yep.
but there's a lot of themes in there that I thought, not, besides the homoerotic stuff, I thought when I was going into all this research, I was like, it's very interesting that she actually brings up these things probably for the first time. Like, Kirsten
Yeah.
Dunst, the idea of a child vampire, and not just a vampire who is chronologically hundreds of years old, but stuck in a child's body. And Kirsten Dunst gives some speech in the movie where she's like, "I am perpetually a child. I will never be a woman." And it's like it's a crazy idea to give that much, to make a creature that is lethal that relatable, to say, "Holy shit, that is an insane thing to wrap my mind around, to be somebody who is essentially more developed than their physical form."
Yeah. I was reading a bit about Anne Rice, and she definitely recontextualized the concept of a vampire. And, like, so many of the things we love today wouldn't exist without that recontextualization. Like, everything in Buffy kind of plays off of
Yeah.
things she reinterpreted. So, like, even if you're critical of her and her writing, you gotta hand it to her.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea that if they don't get enough blood, they shrivel up and turn into a corpse, that's from that story where Tom
Yep.
Cruise is like, he goes insane. I haven't seen it in a while, but I'm pretty sure Brad Pitt decides he doesn't wanna eat people anymore, and so Tom Cruise goes insane and, like, kills humans that he had known, and so they retaliate and they lock him up somehow, and then he's trapped for years and hundreds of years, and he shrivels up, right? But
Yeah.
that is a concept that's where I first learned about it, and I think that's really where it stemmed from.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, and I was also thinking that being a vampire is also becomes seen as something that could be a trauma. It's portrayed as lonely. We start to think of vampires as being lonely. But then there are also these living archives of history. And then we have some stories that glorify immortality outright, but then we have other stories that frame it as a curse. So it becomes like they're not just predators anymore. We are now starting to look at them in a different light, humanize them a little bit, and see them as people that have these, like, eternal consequences of, like, some moment that happened in their lives when they were some age, right? That's because this
Yeah.
is this is, like, the backstory is whatever age they present as, like, a 25-year-old. Some poor 25-year-old was walking through the alley in, like, West London in 1731 and got snatched by a vampire, and now this is the consequence of that one thing happening in their life, and it's just kind of interesting how we essentially just said, "We're gonna make vampires relatable, we're not gonna be afraid of them anymore. They're still kinda scary, but they don't have to be."
Yeah. And this something I brought up in another episode was the ambiguity of what it means to not have a soul. And I think
Oh,
that emerges around this time when we start to sympathize with vampires.
right,
Because up until now, they've just been like straight, like savage beasts that just want to consume blood. But now we're like, well, what about the vampire's feelings?
right,
And in order to consider the vampire's feelings, you kind of have to dial back what it means to not have a soul. Because, like,
right,
we sympathize with these characters. Even like in Buffy, we have like the black and white, either they have a soul or they don't. But like, we like Spike when he doesn't have a soul,
yeah,
and we like him when he
abs
does have a soul.
right, for sure. I agree with that, but that kind of made me think about, when you were talking about having a soul versus not having a soul. I mean, I don't wanna yes, I wanna give credit where credit is due, but is this another interview with a vampire thing? Because
I think so.
she doesn't talk about I didn't read the book, I've only seen the movie, but I don't think she talks about souls. But either way, they're both soulless creatures, but Lestat has a conscience, and
Exactly, yeah.
that's what separates him from the other vampires. And you don't know what gives him his conscience. He somehow preserves it, or maybe he's just that much more conscientious or self-aware. You don't know what is the thing that makes him so reflective. There's actually a little bit of that in, The Vampire Diaries. Did you ever see that show?
No.
So the rules in that show are that whether or not a person is consumed by bloodlust is a choice. It's a choice to abandon your humanity and embrace the bloodlust. And so there's opportune times where these characters who are trustworthy and likable and you feel like they're safe can turn at any minute because something could happen to convince them that it's not worth it anymore, and so I wanna abandon my humanity. I mean, it one of the pivotal moments is when I think one of them's in love with the main character and she rejects him, something like that, and so then it's like, "Ugh, I
Mhm.
abandoned my humanity and I'm now on a thirsty rampage," and then it becomes, "Oh, we have to get him and get him to accept his humanity again," so it's a totally different idea, but it is kind of stemming from this notion of a soul or a conscience or this element that we can't really define that makes us good people, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because over time, vampires really have become more people, and it
Yeah,
raises the question of what is a person?
yeah. And more I think over time, it has become more of an examination of who we are. And yes, what is a person, but also what is it that makes us the way we are, right? What is it that makes a person
Yeah.
good? What is it that makes a person evil?
Yeah, nurture versus nature.
Yeah. Would you say nurture versus nature?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you said nature versus nature. And I was like, in a
Well.
way. Um, but yeah, so and I think that after that, the myth just keeps expanding because after you have this idea of we have sympathetic vampires now, we have vampires that could be good, then you have, okay, what's making them vampires? Can we fix that? So then you get stories about vampirism as being a contagion or a virus and could possibly be cured because that is what every human being is secretly wanting to be someone's white knight, right? And they want to save them. Um,
Yeah.
and so that's you get stories like Blade, where he's a half vampire, and which is a thing, I guess. And
Yeah.
then he has not a cure. He's looking for a cure, but he has some serum that can keep his vampiric half at bay. Then you have vampires developing clans and hierarchies, vampire culture, like their underworld, Twilight, True Blood even
Yeah.
has a bunch of there's a structure, every town has, like, a sheriff, and every parish has someone who has a vampire that's in charge, and they all have people that report to them and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then on the other side, this is where people are no longer helpless. This is when we start fighting back. This is when you start to see
Yeah.
vampire hunters and those stories come up.
And going back to the disease bit, I think, you made me think of I Am Legend. Have you seen that or any of the other adaptions of that story?
I've seen it once, and I don't remember it very well.
It goes very heavy into the, like, it's a virus thing,
Okay.
and I think that's interesting because really, that's kind of where it came from, was the fear of disease and diseases
Yeah.
caused by dead people, so it kinda came full circle, and then in that one, like, it's straight up like, most people, I think, call them zombies in that movie, and, like, I don't blame them because that's more of how they're portrayed, but it's interesting that they went all the way into the, like, it's a virus, and the main character portrayed in that version by Will Smith is researching the virus.
Yeah.
So, he's almost like a different kind of vampire hunter, and there's another version with Vincent Price, and in that one, he's just a vampire hunter, he's just staking them. So it's like
Okay.
kinda like 2 different versions of vampire hunters. In one, he's actually just hunting them in the classic way, and in the other, he's hunting them to cure the disease with science.
Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't think of scientists trying to find a cure for vampirism as being another kind of vampire hunter. That's a really good point because it's true, they are targeting this particular thing. Um, and yeah, and I wonder if that the emergence of vampirism as a contagion or disease or a virus, if that kind of coincides with latent fears about disease and, because
Well, it was
our
right around the time of the Black Plague, so,
yeah,
like,
okay.
it definitely that fed into it, I think, a lot, and that's why, like, people fully believed in the vampire and fully were terrified of them.
Yeah. But then we start thinking about it as, okay, it is a contagion, but we have modern medicine, so maybe we can actually fight back.
Yeah.
But this is where we get, I think the buddings of when we start as a culture fighting back against this idea of vampire. We're not just helpless victims being snatched away in the night anymore. Now we have Van Helsing. Now we have Buffy. Now we have Blade. We have people that take up the cause of protecting society from vampires. It's interesting.
Yeah. I'd also think it's interesting the concept of Van Helsing because obviously the name comes from the Dracula book, but the Van Helsing who's become like kind of a cultural icon of like he wears a fedora and like
Yeah.
kills vampires with a crossbow is so different. And I'm not really sure when that emerged, but at this point he's almost as iconic as Dracula.
Yeah, definitely. And I would imagine there's a history about Van Helsing because it feels like an older story. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some seminal figure hundreds of years ago that, in the midst of in the midst of the vampires evolving in the way we've been talking about, this guy is in the background trying to kill kill them all. First, he was the revenant catcher, I wouldn't
Yeah.
be surprised about that.
And that's also like part of the Van Helsing legend is that like there's been generations of vampire hunters with
Right.
their secret society. So like
Yeah. How
that's
far
pretty
does it
compelling.
how far does it go
I
back?
I love the secret society aspect of vampires. I'm not sure exactly when that popped up, but anytime I see that they have like whole underground civilizations, I'm like, fuck
Yeah.
yeah, I'm on board.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it's more, I guess, more common than is talked about. There's always an implication that the greater public doesn't know, right? There's a really awesome part in True Blood with Dennis O'Hare, where he's essentially like, "I'm gonna tell the whole world about us, and it's this big thing." But you don't realize that it is this big thing, and he opens a whole can of worms, right? Because then the world is like, "Holy shit, vampires." But in every story, it seems that it's a secret, and the people that know they're vampires keep their secret, or they're just, traveling in secret or conducting their business in secret or whatever. I think there's an implication that there is a secret element, but then when you realize it's much, much more elaborate, like the the hierarchies in underworld, right? The underworld. It's the name of the movie. Like it represents the
Mhm.
underworld, but it's this whole system developed underneath humanity living on the surface, and they have no idea that this is going on. So it's crazy. It's great. I think
Yeah.
Blade was the same way.
And I think part of the reason I like that so much is it plays on the fact that it could be going on and we just don't know it.
Yeah,
So, like, I like not just with vampires, but with like anything. It's like why I like the X Files so much. It's like, oh yeah, everything's real and it's right under our noses.
yeah,
And it's like I can suspend my disbelief and be like, yeah, I'm actually just clueless.
yeah. No, that's really cool, and things that you never thought about, and you're suddenly like,
Yeah.
"Wow, that is now within my purview, and I'm fucking terrified."
Yeah.
You know what scared me the first time I ever heard about the first time I ever heard about it? The fucking catacombs. Scared the shit out of me
Oh,
when I first heard about it. I didn't know anything about it, and then I think I maybe learned a little bit about it before that movie As Above, So Below, where those girls get lost in the
yeah.
catacombs, and then I saw that movie, and I was like, "It's everything I thought it was." Holy shit.
It's like the idea of being lost in endless tunnels is bad enough, but then you line them with fucking skulls.
Oh,
And it's like, what
yes.
the fuck?
Yeah,
It wasn't scary enough?
and then you get to a door that no one knew was there.
Yeah.
Something writ inscriptions over it that no one can read, like, actually, I think it's, like, a line from Dante or something fucked up like that.
That's definitely one of the things that gets under my skin most is just the idea of like being lost in a cave and how you could just wander around forever until you die and never find sunlight
Yeah.
again. That's like one of the scariest things I can imagine. That's why, have you seen The Descent?
I've seen The Descent. I saw The Descent around I think it came out around the same time.
Yeah, and that I think is like one of the scariest movies.
Yeah. No, The Descent's scary. No, the catacombs scared the shit out of me when I learned that they were real. When I learned that they were
Yeah,
just extensive underground tunnels snaking through is it Paris?
yeah.
Yeah, just, like, snaking through the city, and no one fucking knows what's down there, like anyway, I it scared the hell out of me when I first learned about it. I think I was, like, in college. That's a good segue because I'm talking about darkness and things being scary and being afraid of the unknown, and I think that we also start to see a genre shift in terms of vampires, where they're shifting away from horror. They're adding fantasy elements, they're adding action, they're adding romance, and they're adding comedy. So that's when we start to see,
Oh
like,
yeah.
the farce, the vampire farces, and maybe a little bit more
Yeah.
of the Bela Lugosi coming in.
Yeah. And we get stuff like blood-sucking bastards.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most recent additions to the lore is the escalation of what sunlight does. Because in, like, Abigail and Blood-Sucking Bastards, those fuckers explode.
Yeah.
So we went in about the last 100 years, we went from it weakens them to, "Oh, no, it sets them on fire," to they explode into just blood everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think it kinda went like from what I read, Lost Boys was kind of the first thing after Nosferatu to escalate it, and then from there, Blade escalated a little more, and then we get this modern era in the last few years where it's like, we're just gonna make them explode as much as possible.
Yeah. So, I fucking love The Lost Boys, it's one of my favorite movies, and there it's an interesting I think it's just fucking genius. The whole tone is, like, kinda goofy, kinda serious, kinda goofy, kinda serious. It kind of oscillates, right? Especially when you have the Coreys there to just, like, add this, like, goofy element, and this is when the Coreys are in their prime, right? They're both, like,
Mhm.
15 or 16, and they're in a
Yeah.
bunch of things in this point. But their presence adds this levity to the movie. But then there's also Jason Patrick's character who is, like, slowly being consumed by this darkness, and so there's this menacing element going throughout. You know, you never get away from that no matter how much you try to add things to the genre. There's always that underlying element. Even, like, with Abigail, right? I think there's some, like, comedy in Abigail until you realize, "Holy shit, this little girl is, like, fucking tearing them apart."
Oh, yeah, for sure. Do you think The Lost Boys is kind of the first thing to add that level of levity to the genre?
I don't know. Possibly, because it's not necessarily making fun of them, but it's more like not taking it seriously.
Yeah.
Also, one piece of lore that I don't know if it's from this movie, but it's definitely in the movie, is that if you were turned into a vampire, you don't become a full vampire until you kill someone.
Ah.
But yeah, so like I said, vampires become sympathetic. They're restrained and romanticized. Sometimes they're heroes, but they are still beings that survive by consuming human blood. And so now the stories they're portrayed as loving people. Like it's such a wild trajectory from where it started, right? But I think that we're now using vampires as a vehicle for analyzing ourselves, right? We start to think of what does it mean to have an insatiable hunger for something that hurts someone else, right? There's stories about addiction interwoven in there. What does it mean to even need somebody?
And of course, at that point, they have to introduce the concept of the vegan vampire that feeds on
Yeah,
animals.
which is
Because previously it was pretty much vampires only fed on humans, but now we have to come up with a way where they can not snuff people out.
yeah, or we can keep them as a character so they're not a threat, but we can continue to explore their
Yeah.
personality.
But there's no better way to make them not a threat than what they do to Spike in Buffy, because that shit is hilarious.
Yeah. But okay, so this is where I think I wanna talk about something we talked about before we started, which is this evolution of what vampires look like. And
Yeah.
so you already talked about Bela Lugosi at first, and I think what you told me earlier is that the other trajectory is, Nosferatu, right?
Yeah. So basically, you kind of get that split because in the Dracula book, he is he's inspired by Vlad the Impaler, so he's like an aristocratic count, but he's also grotesque and monstrous. So the two adaptations kind of split those into two entirely separate characters. And the Bela Lugosi one doesn't even have fangs, but the Nosferatu has just nothing but fangs,
Yeah.
and he's got no hair, and he's no one would ever be attracted to him unless you have some kind of weird monster kink. He's a beast. He's just
Yeah.
a beast man. And that's kind of the split is like, are you the sexy, basically a human but pale vampire, or are you the subhuman monster vampire?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because it kind of got me thinking about creating a really bright line between human and monster, right? And that's where these 2 paths kind of lead. But I'm actually wondering if at some point they merge, because we get the vampires that we know who are these, like, beautiful, sexy people, but then they have a monster form, right? And they sometimes can have a deformed
Yeah.
face. Most of the time, they just have fangs, but sometimes they're ugly, right, when they turn into the monster.
Yeah, like Buffy,
Right.
they get their weird makeup face.
You're right, because even though we have this version where it's merged, we also have the I Am Legend vampires. So and then there's vampires I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but there are vampires where they don't have the option to put their fangs away. Have you ever seen stories like that?
I feel like that's pretty common.
What do you mean common in terms of
Well, first of all, like all the Nosferatu ones just have permanent fangs.
right. Well, no, I was thinking of, like,
So,
human
I yeah, and I feel like it depends on whether your story requires that
okay.
because I've seen some where they have to file their fangs down to blend into human culture, but a lot of the time, the putting the fangs away is just kind of, like, required to
For
tell
the
your
story.
story
Yeah,
where they can blend in, but also feed on people.
yeah.
But speaking of transformation, there's one thing we haven't talked about at all, and that's transforming into a bat.
Transforming into other things too, right? Not just the bat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where
Yeah, I believe transforming into a bat mostly comes from the
it's from
Dracula
Dracula,
novel.
yeah.
I think a lot of it, aside from the vampire bat literally feeding on blood, comes from the idea of demon wings being bat wings, which
Oh,
I think it's
yeah.
kinda interesting. You never really see vampires with bat wings,
Yeah.
which I don't know why, because that would look cool as fuck.
Yeah. But depictions of demons with bat wings feels very, very old. I feel like I've seen,
There's, like,
like,
18th century
paintings,
paintings
yeah.
of
There's a painting, it's a terrifying painting. I think it's called The Garden of Earthly Delights. Have you ever seen it?
that rings a bell.
Yeah, it's a painting by Netherlandish master Hieronymus Bosch, painted sometime between 1490 and 1510.
Yes, I've
So,
seen
yeah,
this.
if you look at the Garden of Earthly Delights, that picture, there's on one side, there's all kinds of, like, terrifying little creations there, and this is from 14th century or whatever.
Yeah, this guy was on some shit.
Yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, the creatures in that are frightening, and, they're demonic, and I assume they're supposed to be demonic because you know, it's Earth on Earth above and below, right? But yeah, so the bat wings feel very old, but the
Yeah,
turning into a bat, that probably that's probably a Dracula thing. I don't think it was
that's
a
what I
thing
was
before.
seeing.
And so then flying,
Yeah, I mean, that comes naturally.
yeah.
And also, back to the Jiangxi, they also were sometimes known to fly, so it's crazy to me how many things just emerge completely parallel, which almost makes me think, I don't know, maybe they are real.
That is not what I thought you were gonna say. I thought you were gonna say, "Maybe it is all stemming out of our primal fears, and we're all connected, and we all have the same primal fear." No, they're just real.
I think we're sleeping on the underground vampire culture.
We've all seen it, and we're in denial still.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I still chalk it up to the primal fear thing, but back to appearances, I think one thing that's interesting is the idea of secrecy again, because looking like a human, passing for a human is necessary to keep your secret. Otherwise, if you are a monster, you have to hide. Or you live in a world like I Am Legend and everything's gone to hell and so you just don't give a shit. But there's this aspect of not just hiding in plain sight, but also being manipulative and lying to the people around you. And so it's almost like vampires will always be evil because they have to hide who they really are. They have to lie to you, they have to manipulate you, they have to essentially do things without your consent. They have to deceive you. And so the monster isn't obvious because it passes for human, but the monster is still there. And I think that's a very modern idea that there are monsters lurking among us. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier about how the idea of vampires has slowly evolved alongside human civilization and is just a reflection of our fears or whatever things we secretly want or curious about, right? But now we've come to this point where there are monsters lurking among us. And I think that that's very it's accurate.
I mean, I think that's always been lying under the surface. I think all of this kind of stems from that. And parallel to the fear of people being vampires at the same time was the fear of people being witches. So,
Right. That's true.
witches look exactly like us, but secretly they're plotting against us.
Yeah.
So this paranoia, I think, is as old as humans, really, and I think we've just come up with new names for it over the
Yeah.
centuries.
And as we have like modern comforts, we realize, slowly have to realize that our modern comforts still don't alleviate some of these fears. I mean, and at some point we should definitely talk about werewolves because that
Oh yeah,
I think
absolutely.
is a very similar storyline to vampires.
Yeah, I'll say right now, witches and werewolves definitely on the
Oh,
table for
yeah.
the Folklore
No,
Files.
yeah, and it's funny because I was gonna say I wanna skip over the gender politics stuff because we probably will go into that heavily if we talk about witches, but I do wanna point out, and I think I've mentioned this before, my pet peeve about exorcism stories is that the person possessed is always a young girl or a woman. It irritates the shit out of me because it goes back to that weak
Mhm.
constitution bullshit, and just, the original evil, and women are just so quick to let the demon in. But vampire stories do the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that it plays out that way because it really seems like it's men who are constantly giving into their the worst things they could be giving into. It's not little girls. It's almost never little girls. It's
Yeah,
always men. So it's like, why are men never being possessed? They're the ones who, like, the slightest temptation will turn
yeah.
them into
And then they
monsters.
blame the temptation, not their propensity to have become a monster in the first place. Vampires do the same thing though, and it's never bothered me the way it bothers me with, exorcisms. I think there's like an agency part, like a bodily agency aspect to that really unsettles me. But with vampires, women are victims, but then they're empowered in a way because now they have abilities and now they get to choose what they wanna do with it, and female vampire characters are always portrayed in a femme fatale vixen way, right? Which goes back
Oh,
to,
absolutely.
you know,
Yeah.
the man not being responsible for his own impulses. But at the same time, there is still some element. I mean, yeah, maybe they wanna say like, "Oh, look at her, she's evil and she's possessing him, and this poor guy, he didn't stand a chance." But there is still an element where this female character is being empowered with these abilities. So, I don't know, it's interesting, but yeah, no, we don't like to see men get corrupted, or maybe it's redundant. We don't need to see men become corrupt because
Mm,
it's overkill. It's
that's a
overkill,
good point.
right? We need to see the pure vessels become corrupted. But yeah, anyhow, I think we've made some progress now that we have, like, female protagonists in these stories that aren't evil, or female heroes, and, do we wanna talk about Buffy for a second? I mean, I don't know if before Buffy there was a a a female character who killed vampires, or a female character who killed monsters in general. Do we know?
Um, I can't think of any.
Okay, interesting.
And I think that probably is kind of what inspired Buffy was the need for a female of this
Yeah,
archetype.
yeah,
Because that's really the core of Buffy is
yeah,
female
and it
empowerment.
wasn't just a woman, it is a a a teenage girl entering womanhood. It's, like, right at the beginning of that where she is
Yeah.
not just impressionable, but also developing her own identity and all kinds of, uh, uh that's a huge can of worms for me. I could totally go on about Buffy for multiple episodes. But, yeah, that's so cool to think that there was this need that was recognized, right? Because it's not always easy to see, and if everybody else sees it, the people who kinda come up with these stories aren't necessarily guaranteed to latch on to it. But, okay, so we do kind of accept that that's the canon, that Buffy is, like, the first idea.
If not, she's definitely a major influential figure in turning the tables and allowing more
Right.
females of that type.
And there's also a Hellsing where the main character is a female, and she's, like, a descendant of Hellsing.
Yes.
Anyway, so the only thing that I had to add was that there is this other aspect to it where we have different communities where vampires kind of developed. Specifically, you have the Southern Gothic vampire, which I didn't really want to go into because I think there's this whole backstory of like racial history and slavery and things like that. But I think that's completely incorporated in that. I think it's really obvious with Sinners where that's the backdrop
Oh,
of
yeah.
the movie. So we can't unpack slavery and racism and vampirism in 5 minutes or however much time we have, but it made me think about that Irish vampire and, like, he has a section of the country where he's living, you know what I mean? Like, there's pockets of immigrants during this period where cultures are kind of existing in these little spaces, and if we accept that vampires are a thing, then all of those little pockets have their own version of a vampire or have a vampire that somehow fits in their culture. That would be interesting to go into.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's like a Angel, where he just goes wherever he wants and somehow blends in, right?
Even though his accent is terrible.
Yeah, I don't know. But okay, did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think that'll do it for now. I mean, we could talk about vampires for ages and ages, so maybe we'll come back and do a part 2 for vampire folklore, but I think that about covers it for me.
Okay. Well, my closing comments just have to do with the fact that I think all of this stems from this original fear of things that look like us turning against us, not being killed, not being hunted by animals, not being hunted by nature, but being hunted by the things that look like us, which is interesting because of all the things that you had to worry about in a primitive society, having enough food or not being, killed by animals, having shelter and all those things, that these primal fears still were there, you know? You think you shouldn't be
Mhm.
focusing your energy on those kinds of things, you should be focusing your energies on the basic things you need to survive, but I guess that's the nature of being human. Once you have your necessities met, then your mind starts to wander and fabricate all these things and think of ways to accept and understand the world around you. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I think it stems from vampires secretly being real. Hashtag vampire truther.
Well, that I guess that shows me. But anyhow, okay, this is really fun. I hope that everyone appreciates our little divergence. What are we going to be watching when we go back to our normal program next week?
All right. Next week, we'll be using our new vampire goggles to revisit the origin of our favorite vampire slayer with the original Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie from 1992.
And I'm going to add very quickly that I kind of don't like this movie. I love
Oh,
I
really?
love the show to death, and there's just something about the movie that I do not like. But we'll talk about it, and I've seen it a bunch, so it'll be a good discussion. Until next time.
Until next time.
This podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License. For additional information and other media content, visit theferalthread.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week. I think it's got these little, like, they could be devils